The massive log wall moved 6 inches to the left, then 6 inches to the right, like a living thing breathing in the darkness. Outside, something large scraped against the cabin's exterior, testing, probing, searching for entry. Elias Thornton sat perfectly still in the center of his cabin, listening to the mechanical clicks and whispers of his impossible creation responding to the threat. The system he'd built 18 months earlier was working exactly as designed, but even he couldn't quite believe what he was witnessing. What drove a man to engineer walls that could move, floors that could shift, and a cabin that could literally close itself like a fist around anything that tried to enter uninvited would become the most closely guarded secret in the Rocky Mountains. And the technique that saved his life that December night in 1843 would go on to protect dozens of mountain men from dangers they never saw coming. Before we uncover this remarkable story, let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious if any of you live near the old trapping territories, and if tales of frontier ingenuity and survival fascinate you the way they fascinate me, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're diving into the mystery of the California trail wagons that vanished without a trace. The blood trail led from the door of the cabin to the tree line 40 yards away, and Elias Thornton followed it with his rifle raised, knowing what he would find, but hoping he was wrong. His partner, Marcus Whitfield, had stepped outside at dawn to check their trap lines along Willow Creek in what would later become western Wyoming. The February morning in 1842 had seemed peaceful enough, with fresh snow muffling the forest sounds and no sign of danger in the pristine white landscape. But mountain peace was deceptive, and both men knew it. They had been trapping together for 3 seasons, building a reputation as careful, methodical hunters who took calculated risks and usually came out ahead. Their cabin sat in a sheltered valley, with good water access and natural windbreaks, positioned to give them clear sight lines in 3 directions. They had built it solid, using the standard notched log construction that every mountain man learned, with a heavy door barred from the inside and gaps chinked with moss and mud. It was identical to hundreds of other trappers' cabins scattered across the territories, functional and temporary, meant to last a season or 2 before abandoning it for new hunting grounds. Elias found Marcus 200 yards from the cabin, or what remained of him. The attack had been swift and brutal. A grizzly bear, probably male based on the size of the tracks, had caught Marcus unaware as he bent to check a trap. The rifle lay unfired in the snow. Marcus never had a chance to defend himself. The bear had killed quickly, torn the body partially, and then abandoned it, which suggested this wasn't a predatory attack but a territorial one. The bear saw Marcus as competition and eliminated him with the casual efficiency that made grizzlies the undisputed masters of the mountain wilderness. Elias spent the rest of that day burying his partner on a small rise overlooking the valley. He marked the grave with stones arranged in a cross pattern, and sat beside it until darkness forced him back to the cabin. Inside, he barred the door and sat by the dying fire, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about how quickly death had come. The cabin walls that had seemed solid yesterday now felt fragile as paper. The door that had kept out wind and snow wouldn't stop a determined bear for more than seconds. The entire structure was an illusion of safety, and Marcus had paid the price for believing in that illusion. That night, Elias Thornton made a decision that would consume him for the next 1.5 years. He would build a cabin that no bear, no man, no force of nature could breach. Not just strong, not just reinforced, but something entirely different. Something impossible by conventional frontier standards, something that could defend itself. The first mountain men Elias approached thought he had lost his mind to grief. When he asked about defensive construction techniques at the spring rendezvous of 1842, veteran trappers shook their heads and offered him whiskey instead of advice. But Elias wasn't interested in drowning his sorrows. He had spent 2 months after Marcus died sketching designs in charcoal on birch bark, imagining systems that seemed impossible with the tools and materials available in the wilderness. Standard cabin construction hadn't evolved much since the first trappers entered the mountains decades earlier. Everyone built the same way because it worked well enough, and because anything more complex required skills and materials that didn't exist on the frontier. Elias knew he needed knowledge that mountain men didn't possess. In May of 1842, he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. Instead of heading to his regular trapping grounds, he traveled north to the territories where the Crow Nation made their seasonal camps. The Crow had lived in these mountains for generations before the first white trapper arrived. If anyone understood how to build structures that could withstand the threats of the wilderness, it would be them. The journey took 8 days through difficult terrain, and Elias traveled alone, which was dangerous but necessary. He carried trade goods, tobacco, steel knives, and brass buttons, but more importantly, he carried humility. He wasn't coming as a conqueror or trader, but as a student. His first contact was with a hunting party led by a man named Broken Lance, who spoke enough English to understand Elias's strange request. The hunters found the idea of a white man seeking building knowledge amusing, but they agreed to take him to their village. There, Elias met an elder named Walking Bear, a man in his 70s who had seen the mountains change with the arrival of the trappers. Walking Bear listened to Elias's story about Marcus, about the bear, about his desire to build something that could protect against any threat. The old man sat quietly for a long time, then began to speak about things Elias had never imagined. The Crow, Walking Bear explained, had once built winter shelters using techniques passed down from ancestors who lived when the great ice still covered the northern lands. These weren't the portable teepees the Crow used now, but permanent structures built in sacred places for ceremony and protection. The key, Walking Bear said, wasn't just in making walls stronger, but in making them alive. Elias didn't understand at first, but over the next 3 weeks, Walking Bear and other elders showed him remnants of old structures, explained principles of balance and counterweight, demonstrated how natural forces could be harnessed rather than simply resisted. They spoke of walls that could shift position, of entrances that could seal themselves, of buildings that responded to threat like a living creature pulling into its shell. The list Elias compiled after leaving the Crow village would have seemed insane to any frontier merchant. He needed specific types of wood that most trappers ignored, iron components that didn't exist west of Street, Louis, and tools that belonged in a shipyard, not a mountain cabin. But Walking Bear's teachings had opened his mind to possibilities he'd never considered. The elder had shown him how certain woods possessed natural spring tension that could be harnessed, how weight and counterweight could create movement without external power, how the ancient builders had created structures that seemed to breathe with mechanical life. The first challenge was finding the right trees. Not just any pine or fir would work for what Elias planned. He needed what the Crow called winter dancers, trees that grew on exposed ridges where constant wind had given the wood a natural flex and memory. These trees grew slowly, their grain tight and spiraled, creating timber that wanted to return to its original shape when bent. Most trappers avoided such wood because it was difficult to work with, fighting against the axe and saw. But that resistance was exactly what Elias needed. He spent June and July of 1842 locating and marking suitable trees in a 20-mile radius of his chosen building site. The location itself required careful consideration. He selected a natural depression between 2 rock outcroppings, a place where the earth itself would provide additional protection and concealment. The site had water access from an underground spring, eliminating the vulnerability of fetching water during a siege. He marked 43 trees that met his specifications, each one growing in conditions that had created the internal tension he required. But wood was only part of what he needed. The mechanical components Walking Bear had described required metalwork beyond anything available on the frontier. In August, Elias made a decision that cost him most of his savings from 3 years of trapping. He traveled to St. Louis, a journey of over 1,000 miles, specifically to commission iron parts from a blacksmith who usually made components for riverboats. The smith, a German immigrant named Klaus Steinberg, listened to Elias's specifications with growing bewilderment: pivot joints that could support 500 pounds of lateral pressure, counterweighted pulleys designed to precise ratios, spring-loaded catches that would release at specific trigger weights, track rails that would allow smooth movement of massive loads. Steinberg had never made such things for a building, but the technical challenge intrigued him. The work took 6 weeks and cost Elias $370, nearly a year's earnings for a successful trapper. While Steinberg worked, Elias haunted the warehouses and shipyards of Street to Sef, Louis, studying mechanical systems, watching how heavy loads were moved and controlled. He paid special attention to the balance mechanisms used in warehouse doors and the pivot systems in ships' gun ports. Every detail was stored in his memory, sketched in his growing collection of bark drawings. By late September, he was ready to return to the mountains with 4 pack mules carrying his impossible cargo. The first snow fell on October 3rd as Elias began breaking ground for his impossible cabin. Unlike standard construction where men simply cleared the ground and started stacking logs, Elias was digging. Not just a shallow foundation, but a full excavation, 8 feet deep, 20 feet wide, and 24 feet long. Passing trappers who stopped to observe shook their heads at the sight of one man with a shovel attempting what looked like a mine shaft rather than a cabin foundation. But Elias had a vision they couldn't see. The underground portion would serve 3 critical purposes. First, it would house the counterweight system that would power the moving walls. Second, it would provide storage space that couldn't be breached from above. Third, and most importantly, it would contain the mechanical heart of his defensive system, protected from weather and tampering. He worked alone through October, moving earth with obsessive determination. The rock outcroppings on either side provided natural walls for 2 sides of the excavation, reducing the work but requiring careful engineering to integrate the natural stone with his planned structure. He installed drainage channels first, knowing that water would destroy his mechanical systems faster than any bear. The channels led to a natural fissure in the rock that would carry water away from the foundation. By November, with snow falling regularly, Elias had completed the excavation and begun installing the iron framework Steinberg had created. The main support structure consisted of 12 vertical iron posts, each one sunk 3 feet into bedrock and secured with a mixture of molten lead and pine resin. Between these posts, he installed the track rails that would guide the moving wall sections. The rails had to be perfectly level and aligned, requiring adjustments measured in fractions of inches. The counterweight system occupied the central portion of the underground space. Using principles Walking Bear had explained, Elias created a series of balanced stones, each one carefully selected and weighed. The largest weighed over 800 pounds, a piece of granite he had spent 3 days moving into position using log rollers and leverage. These stones connected through iron pulleys to cables that would run up through the floor to the moving wall sections above. The mechanical precision required was unlike anything attempted in frontier construction. Each pulley had to rotate freely despite temperature extremes. Each cable had to run without binding. Each counterweight had to balance perfectly with its corresponding wall section. Elias spent weeks adjusting, testing, failing, and trying again. His food supplies ran low, but he couldn't stop to hunt. Winter was coming, and the cabin had to be completed before the deep snows made work impossible. The foundation consumed 2 months of brutal labor, but when finished, it was unlike anything ever built in the mountains. From above, it looked like a simple rectangular foundation. From below, it was a mechanical marvel waiting to come alive. The iron framework could support thousands of pounds of dynamic load. The counterweight system could move with finger-touch pressure when properly balanced. The drainage kept the mechanical spaces dry despite autumn rains. The Grizzly arrived on December 23, 1842. Drawn by the scent of fresh elk meat, Elias had hung inside his newly completed cabin. The bear circled the structure 3 times, leaving tracks in the fresh snow while Elias watched through a gun port he'd installed at eye level. The animal stood nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, scarred across its muzzle, probably male, definitely territorial. Elias had been waiting for this moment for over a year. The cabin was complete, every mechanical system tested, every moving part adjusted to perfection. But testing with his own weight and pressure was different from facing 700 pounds of determined grizzly. He sat perfectly still, rifle loaded but lowered, trusting in his engineering rather than firepower. The bear approached the door first, as Elias had predicted. Bears were intelligent enough to recognize doors as weak points in human structures. It pushed against the heavy wooden barrier, testing. The door, reinforced with iron bands and mounted on pivots like the walls, gave slightly under the pressure. This was intentional. The yielding door triggered the first mechanical response. As the door moved inward 2 inches, cables hidden in the frame activated. The wall sections on either side of the door began their synchronized movement. The left wall pivoted outward 6 inches while the right wall moved in the opposite direction. The door, no longer supported by rigid walls, swung sideways along its track, sliding parallel to the moving walls. The bear pushed harder, confused by the structure's response. Where it expected resistance, it found yielding movement that offered no solid purchase for its strength. The harder it pushed, the more the walls shifted, creating an ever-changing geometry that dissipated force rather than meeting it head-on. From inside, Elias heard the mechanical clicks and whispers of his system responding exactly as designed. The counterweights in the basement rose and fell in perfect balance. The pivot points rotated smoothly despite the cold. The entire cabin was moving, breathing, alive with mechanical purpose. The bear stepped back, circled to the corner where traditional cabins showed weakness. It reared up and struck the corner with its full weight and strength. In a standard notched log cabin, this blow would have loosened the entire structure, but Elias's corner wasn't fixed. The impact triggered both adjoining walls to pivot outward, the corner essentially opening like a mouth yawning, then closing again as the bear's weight shifted. The animal stumbled, unbalanced by the unexpected movement. For 20 minutes, the grizzly tested every aspect of the structure. It tried to climb the walls, but the log's smooth surface and outward lean, when pressure was applied, made purchase impossible. It attempted to dig under, but hit the iron-reinforced foundation, extending 3 feet below ground level. It even tried the roof, hauling itself up by brute strength, but the floating roof design simply flexed under its weight, offering no rigid point to attack. Finally, with a last frustrated blow to the door that sent the entire front wall into its full 18-inch lateral movement, the bear gave up. The grizzly's visit revealed flaws Elias hadn't anticipated. While the moving walls had prevented entry, the mechanical noise was louder than expected, and ice formation on the tracks threatened to jam the system during extreme cold. He spent January of 1843 implementing refinements that would transform his prototype into a perfected defense. The noise issue came from metal-on-metal contact in the pivot assemblies. Despite careful lubrication with bear grease, the iron components scraped and clicked when under load. The solution came from an unexpected source. While hunting elk, Elias noticed how quietly the animals moved through snow despite their massive weight. Their hooves had a soft, fibrous pad that cushioned impact. He experimented with leather washers cut from elk hide, boiled in pine resin until they were hard but retained some flexibility. Installing these between every metal contact point reduced the mechanical noise to whispers. The ice problem required more complex engineering. Water from melting snow would seep into the track channels and freeze, potentially locking the walls in place when most needed. Elias created a heating system using principles he'd observed in hot spring formations. He ran copper tubes, hammered from old cookware, through the track channels. These tubes connected to a reservoir positioned near the fireplace. As the fire heated water in the reservoir, convection caused circulation through the tubes, keeping the tracks just warm enough to prevent ice formation. The system worked continuously without intervention, a critical feature for a man who might be injured or under siege. But the most significant addition came from analyzing the bear's attack patterns. The animal had tested each wall section independently, never facing coordinated movement from multiple directions. Elias installed what he called sympathetic triggers, mechanical linkages that caused all walls to respond when any section was pressured. Push the front door, and the side walls would angle outward while the rear wall shifted forward, creating a space that seemed to swallow and redirect force from every direction simultaneously. Testing these improvements required simulating attacks, which Elias accomplished through an ingenious pulley system. He could stand inside and pull ropes that applied hundreds of pounds of pressure to different wall sections, observing how the cabin responded. The refined system was eerily organic in its movement, walls shifting in complex patterns that resembled a living creature's defensive reflexes. In February, an unexpected test proved the value of his refinements. 3 wolves, probably rabid based on their aggressive daylight behavior, attacked the cabin while Elias was processing pelts inside. Unlike the bear's focused assault, the wolves attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. The sympathetic trigger system activated perfectly. As one wolf threw itself against the door, another attacked the sidewall, and the third circled, looking for weakness. The cabin's response was immediate and coordinated. All four walls shifted outward slightly, creating an expanding perimeter that offered no solid impact point. The wolves, already unstable from disease, were completely disoriented by the moving structure. They continued attacking for several minutes, but every leap met shifting walls that absorbed and redirected their momentum. The 7 men arrived at dawn on March 15, 1843, their intentions clear from the way they surrounded Elias's cabin with rifles drawn. They were renegade trappers, the kind who found stealing easier than hunting, led by a man named Portuguese Jack, who had a reputation for violence along the Green River territory. Elias had heard them coming for 20 minutes, their horses and careless conversation carrying through the still morning air. He was already positioned at his defensive station, a raised platform in the cabin's center that gave him clear sight lines through multiple gun ports. But he didn't immediately reach for his rifle. He wanted to see how his creation would handle human intelligence combined with hostile intent. Portuguese Jack approached the door first, calling out in accented English that they knew Elias was inside and had come for his winter's take of pelts. The threat was explicit: open the door and live, or they would burn him out. It was a common tactic among thieves, fire being the one force no cabin could resist. But Elias had prepared for this possibility too. He remained silent, watching through his gun port as the men spread out, examining his strange cabin with growing puzzlement. The unusual construction clearly unsettled them. The protruding pivot points, the metal tracks visible at the base of walls, the overall sense that this structure was fundamentally different from anything they'd encountered. One of the men, a thin trapper with nervous movements, approached the side wall and pushed against it experimentally. The wall shifted 6 inches outward with an audible mechanical click, then returned to position when he jumped back. The movement triggered the sympathetic response system, causing subtle shifts in all 4 walls that made the entire cabin seem to inhale and exhale. The attackers retreated several steps, unnerved. Portuguese Jack, trying to maintain authority, ordered 2 men to the door while others took positions at corners. They would rush the entrance simultaneously, overwhelming any defense through numbers. It was a sound tactical plan against a conventional cabin. They charged together, 3 men hitting the door with their shoulders while others pushed at the corners. The cabin's response was immediate and devastating. The door slid sideways along its track while the walls pivoted outward in synchronized movement. The men at the door stumbled forward into empty space where solid barrier should have been. Those at the corners found themselves pushing against surfaces that yielded and redirected their force. One attacker fell hard, his shoulder dislocated when the wall he was pushing suddenly pivoted away. The mechanical advantage of the counterweight system meant their combined strength was turned against them. But the true innovation Elias had installed for human threats now activated. Hidden panels in the floor, connected to the same trigger system as the walls, dropped open. These panels covered shallow pits lined with sharpened stakes, not deep enough to kill, but sufficient to trap and injure. 2 attackers fell through, their legs pierced by stakes coated with pine pitch that would cause festering wounds if not treated. The remaining men retreated in chaos, their coordinated assault destroyed by architecture that fought back. Portuguese Jack and his surviving men fled within minutes, carrying their wounded and leaving behind equipment in their desperation to escape the cabin that had defeated them. Word of their humiliation spread through the mountain grapevine faster than wildfire. By April of 1843, trappers were arriving at Elias's cabin not to steal, but to learn. The first was a veteran mountaineer named Samuel Potts, who had lost 2 partners to grizzly attacks in 5 years. He approached cautiously, calling out from 50 yards away, explaining his purpose. Elias, recognizing an honest man seeking knowledge, invited him inside. What followed was a 3-day education that would change how a generation of mountain men thought about construction. Potts was astounded by the mechanical complexity hidden within what appeared from outside to be merely an unusual cabin. Elias walked him through every system, explaining not just how things worked, but why he had designed them that way. The moving walls weren't just about deflecting force, but about psychological impact. Predators and humans alike expected rigid resistance. When structures moved in response to attack, it triggered deep instinctual confusion. The sympathetic trigger system meant attackers could never focus force on a single point without creating compensating movement elsewhere. The trap panels weren't meant to kill, but to incapacitate and demoralize. Every element served multiple defensive purposes while maintaining the cabin's livability. Potts took detailed notes, sketching mechanisms and measuring components. But Elias knew that few men had the resources or skills to replicate his full system. So he began developing simplified versions that captured the essential principles without requiring impossible precision. The basic moving wall could be built with wooden pivots instead of iron, using river stones as counterweights. The effect was less smooth but still effective against bears. Over the following months, Elias taught 17 different trappers. Some came skeptical and left converted. Others arrived desperate, having barely survived attacks on their conventional cabins. Each man received instruction tailored to his skills and resources. A trapper with blacksmith experience learned to forge simple pivot mechanisms. Another with carpentry background focused on the specialized joinery that allowed controlled movement. A young mountaineer named Thomas Crawford became Elias's most dedicated student, staying 6 weeks to master every detail. The teaching process revealed improvements Elias hadn't considered. Crawford suggested angling the gun ports to allow wider fields of fire while maintaining narrow external openings. Potts contributed an idea for emergency exits through moving floor panels that could serve as escape routes if the main entrance was compromised. Each student added refinements born from their own survival experiences. By autumn of 1843, Elias had created what he called the Mountain Builder's Guide, a collection of drawings and instructions covering everything from basic moving walls to complete defensive systems. He carved the illustrations on thin wooden plates that could be copied by pressing paper against the indentations. The text was simple and direct, assuming no formal education but reasonable frontier competence. The guide spread through the trapping community like precious currency, copied and recopied, modified and improved by each new builder. The last known moving wall cabin stood until 1927, when a forest fire swept through the Absaroka Range, consuming the structure that had survived 84 years of wilderness extremes. By then, the cabin had passed through many hands, each owner maintaining and improving Elias Thornton's original mechanisms. The fire revealed something remarkable in the ruins. The iron framework of the counterweight system had survived, along with portions of the pivot assemblies, creating an archaeological puzzle that would baffle investigators for decades. It wasn't until 1993 that a graduate student studying frontier architecture connected the bizarre iron remains to references in trapper journals about breathing cabins and living walls that had protected mountain men from certain death. The investigation that followed uncovered a hidden chapter of American frontier innovation. Elias Thornton had died in 1868, not in his mechanical marvel but peacefully in a California settlement where he'd retired after 25 years in the mountains. His journals, discovered in an estate sale, revealed that his moving wall design had spread far beyond what historians had imagined. He documented 43 cabins built using his complete system and estimated that over 200 incorporated at least basic moving wall principles. The survival rate among trappers who built these defensive cabins was remarkable. While general mortality in the mountain man profession approached 40% over a 5-year period, those using Thornton's techniques showed losses under 10%. The difference represented dozens of lives saved through engineering rather than firepower. Modern analysis of Thornton's design reveals sophistication that seems impossible for the 1840s frontier. His counterweight ratios matched modern mechanical engineering principles. His use of sympathetic movement anticipated concepts in responsive architecture by over a century. His integration of psychological and physical defense created a system that defeated threats through confusion and mechanical advantage rather than brute resistance. The Wyoming State Museum now houses a partial reconstruction of a Thornton-style moving wall cabin built from specifications found in various mountain man journals and archaeological evidence. Visitors can push against the walls and watch the entire structure respond with fluid, organic movement. Children laugh at the sensation while engineers study the mechanical principles with professional admiration. But perhaps the true legacy lies not in museums, but in the principle Elias Thornton proved in those desperate months after his partner's death. Faced with an impossible problem, he refused to accept conventional limitations. He combined knowledge from unexpected sources, Native American wisdom with riverboat mechanics, natural tree properties with precise engineering, psychological understanding with physical design. His moving walls saved lives not through strength but through adaptability, not through rigidity but through yielding that redirected force. In the end, one mountain man's impossible trick became a tradition of innovation that spread across the Rocky Mountains, protecting a generation of frontier Americans through the simple recognition that sometimes the best defense isn't standing firm, but knowing exactly how to move.